will be here for this debate between the two candidates running for Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Democratic nominee, David Schapira, a former high school teacher, former teacher at Arizona State University, up until last year, high school administrator at the East Valley Institute of Technology, former legislature, both in the House and the Senate, former Tempe City Councilman, and former member of the Tempe Union High School District Governing Board, Kathy Hoffman, who has worked in her professional career as bilingual education and in special education, former preschool teacher in Tucson, which prompted her to get her master's in speech language pathology at the University of Arizona. We have two of the three states' universities represented here. A speech therapist in the Peoria Unified School District now. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you for watching. Format will be minute opening, minute closing, and then a series of questions, some of which came from Facebook from our readers. So we will start by determination from a roll of the dice tonight with Kathy Hoffman. You have a minute for an opening statement.
Thank you. Well, first I just want to say thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here. And my journey into politics began last year when I realized that our elected officials and our state government were failing my students. I have worked my entire professional career in our public schools. As a speech therapist, I've worked with students of all backgrounds. Many of my students are bilingual, some are gifted, some are in the LGBTQ community, and I want to make sure to fight for all of my students to have the resources that they need to be successful in our public schools. Because through this role, I know that Arizona's future starts in our schools, and I look forward to discussing all of these education topics further to talk about how we can move our education system forward.
Thank you, Kathy Hoffman. David Schapira, you have a minute for an opening.
Thank you, Richard, and to the Republic for inviting us here this evening. My journey started a little bit longer ago. My family's been in Arizona since the 1940s. My kids are the fourth generation, actually, of Shapiras to go to public schools in this state. And we've been watching what's happened in the education system since my grandparents were met at Tucson High School. My parents went to Central, and I grew up going to school here in Phoenix. And to see the changes in our education system in this state over those years has been disheartening because of failures of elected leadership at the state capitol. I decided to leave the classroom and get involved in politics and ran for the state legislature, served there for 6 years on the education committee as the ranking member for 4 years, and on my local school board and as a school administrator because I wanted to make a difference in as many kids' lives as I could, and that's why I'm running for state school superintendent, to ensure that my daughters and all Arizona children have the opportunities they deserve.
Thank you. We'll get right to the questions. We'll start with Kathy Hoffman. The Red for Ed movement, kind of a big deal. There was a school walk-ins, led to some walkouts, or led to a 6-day walkout in late April. There was a bit, well, let me ask you, on the campaign trail, have you talked to parents who thought the Red for Ed movement went too far, that the walkout was a bad choice? What is your response to them?
Honestly, I have not had conversations where parents were in disagreement with Red for Ed. By and large, there was tons of community support for Red for Ed. I personally was proud to be one of 78% of educators that voted yes to walk out. These were educators from all backgrounds, and that was something that I was extremely proud of, to see educators from all backgrounds. We had paraprofessionals, bus drivers, teacher aides down at the Capitol rallying for the future of our schools. And then when I was walking through the crowds at the Capitol, I also saw parents and community members also from all backgrounds. We had Democrats, Republicans, independents, people from all walks of life, because Arizona realizes that education is the most important issue right now facing our state, and that the future of our students and our kids is what's at stake. And so I've mainly only heard immense support from the community.
Mr. Schapira, same thing on the trail? What are you hearing about the Red for Ed movement?
We've heard a lot of support, and it was great to be down at the Capitol during the 6 days of the walkout with fellow educators from across the state. 65,000 people marching from Chase Field down to the Capitol to have their voices be heard by their elected leaders in the state legislature. It was an awe-inspiring thing for me. When I was in the legislature, I remember when the cuts were coming down and the Republican leadership in the House and Senate and Governor Brewer decided to cut $2 billion from our public schools, balancing the budget on the backs of our kids. And I remember shouting from the rooftops on the floor of the legislature. I remember standing strong against those cuts, giving a passionate speech and looking up into the gallery that was empty. And so to see the change from that to now, 65,000 educators and parents marching on their state capitol, asking for their legislature and their governor to meet their constitutional obligations to our kids was really inspiring.
And a follow for both of you, I mean, although you may not have seen it on the trail, there is at least some population of parents out there who seemed frustrated about the walkout. And I guess we don't know how large a minority or majority that constitutes. What would you say to parents who thought, boy, I wish they had taken a different tact rather than shutting down the schools?
You know, I did hear from parents that the walkout made their lives difficult in many cases. I also heard that from educators and from students. In fact, Richard, I don't know a single teacher who wanted to walk out. But, you know, I think most people understand that those of us who've been advocating for the resources, the necessary resources for our students to get the opportunities they deserve, for so many years, we have tried every arrow in the quiver to first prevent them from balancing the budget on the backs of our kids, and second, to restore the funding that was cut from our schools 10 years ago. But starting this last school year, we had $1.1 billion less in our schools than we did a decade ago. Schools are starting this and next week. Schools still this year will have $700 million less than they had a decade ago. And so the walkout really was the last arrow in the quiver to get the legislature to meet its constitutional obligations. The court tried to do it. The state Supreme Court tried to get the legislature to meet their Prop 301 obligations, and that didn't work. And so this was our last remaining option.
And I mean, you did vote and chose to walk out. What would you say to parents who were frustrated about that choice?
I absolutely understand that some parents were frustrated by this choice, that there are parents out there who felt that way. I do think it is a small minority of parents because I think most parents realize what is at stake here, that Arizona has cut more from education than any other state in the country. And we also have a very low per pupil spending compared to the national average. And parents feel that when every school year they return and they have to pay for school supplies, and teachers have to pay for school supplies. This is a common thread that parents and teachers are picking up where the state has left off. And further, I'd like to add that roughly 1/5 of our children are living in poverty, and I imagine that it was especially hard for families of lower socioeconomic status to cope with the walkout because it would be much harder to come up with babysitting options. And so I am very sympathetic to families that had those types of struggles, and I was very appreciative of communities coming together. We saw churches and other types of community centers coming together to make sure that kids were fed and had their needs met during the walkout.
Thank you for that. Last night we had the Republicans here who had a lot of differences between them among the five. And spoiler alert, but you two seem aligned on some of the major education policy decisions facing the state. So I'll ask you, starting with Mr. Schapira, what differentiates you from your opponent?
You know, we've been on the trail. Kathy and I were talking just a few weeks ago, trying to figure out how many forums we've had like this and in other settings, and I'm pretty sure it's in triple digits at this point. And I found the same thing that you said, and that is that we align on a lot of policy views and viewpoints, and we have very similar visions, I think, for the future of the state. I think the biggest difference between the two of us that we found is just different experiences. We've both worked in the school setting. I started my career as a classroom teacher, but I've also seen it from the other side as working in school leadership. I've also been a school board member, and I fought in the trenches for our kids at the state capitol, in the legislature, in the House and Senate, and was the leader of the Democrats in the state Senate. So I've seen it from a lot of different perspectives, our education system. I was also, by the way, a student in our public schools, and I have two children in the public school system in this state right now. So I think it's really just experiential differences, but let me be clear, I think Kathy is far more qualified than our current superintendent of schools, who's never worked a day in a school.
Kathy Hoffman, what do you think differentiates you from your opponent?
I agree that at the end of the day, it is critically important to have a Democrat in the office of Superintendent of Public Instruction come November, no matter what. That is the most important thing, and we do agree on a lot of policies. Where I have tried to differentiate myself is in terms of my experience and also in terms of priorities. And I'm trilingual. I had the privilege growing up of attending a Japanese immersion program, and then in college I realized Japanese isn't actually that useful here. And so I went on to learn Spanish, which is, I think, critically important to have a superintendent of public instruction that can understand the importance and all the research behind bilingualism, that we should be treating it as a professional asset for our students, that we should expand our bilingual programs in Arizona to make sure that every child has good opportunities. And I think that those experiences, as well as my experience in special education, working with some of our most marginalized and vulnerable kids, and having worked in my entire professional career in our public schools, being very close to seeing what is happening in our schools and what needs to change, and I am ready to step into that position of superintendent and do that.
You did try to differentiate yourself in one way, and it's a very eye-catching ad because I saw it on the television. It caught my eye across the newsroom. With an ad that had some not so nice things to say about your opponent. What did you describe your thoughts about putting that ad together? And once it was out, I mean, did you have any second thoughts about releasing that ad?
I want to make it very clear that when I am superintendent of public instruction, I will always stand up to bullies, and I will always elevate the voices of teachers. That is the most important thing. I know that to be the superintendent of public instruction, it is a leadership role, and when I step into that role, that I want to make sure that I cultivate an environment, a work environment, where people feel respected and supported. And at the end of the day, it's all about fighting for the future of our schools, fighting for our students, and I feel very strongly that I'm ready to step in that leadership role.
Right. Well, I guess because the ad did portray your opponent as a bully, do you think the bullying behavior is to a level where he would be unfit to serve as a superintendent of public instruction?
Well, again, I want to focus on the fact that my own personal experience is that I want to be serving as superintendent as someone who builds a place where people feel comfortable coming together, expressing their concerns, that don't feel fearful, that aren't fearful of intimidation tactics. And so that's the type of leadership that I think we need as superintendent of public instruction.
Mr. Schapira, there's a lot of follow-ups to ask. One of them is, I mean, obviously we see the best face you're putting on right now. Is there another David Schapira behind the scenes? Is there someone who, when behind closed doors, doesn't know he's being taped, as was mentioned in the ad, is someone who engages in sort of bullying behavior? Can you be intimidating behind the scenes?
I consider myself to be a very passionate person, and I'm like that, I think, in any setting. Anyone who knows me well, I think, would attest to that. It is odd for me to have the bullying accusation thrown my way, because as someone who grew up being bullied for being different, for having a different religious belief than many of the other kids in my school, being one of the only Jewish kids in my entire school. When I got to the legislature, one of my priorities was to help ensure that other kids across the state didn't have those kinds of experiences, and also to make sure that educators were treated with respect. And so when I was in the Senate, I ran a bill to stop bullying in Arizona, and unfortunately that bill was killed, made it out of the Senate and was killed over in the House, but the Democrats continue to run that bill at the state capitol every year. And so it was odd to have that accusation thrown my way. I mean, I will say this, we talked about the differences between mine and Kathy's experiences, and I started my career in the classroom, and like Kathy, when I had needs that needed to be addressed, if there were issues that came up, I would take those to our administration. If there were conflicts between students or with parents or between colleagues, educators oftentimes will take those issues to their administration. The difference between Kathy and myself is I've also seen it from the other perspective. Having been a school leader, I've had educators come to me who've had issues with students, with parents, with colleagues. And as a leader, you have to make hard decisions. And oftentimes when you make those hard decisions, some people walk away not satisfied. And so if the question is, are there people who've walked away unsatisfied from decisions that I've made? Clearly, because you're never going to make everybody happy in leadership. But I think having had that experience as a leader is critical for our next state school superintendent. We've had a series of school superintendents who haven't been leaders in the education setting, and I think that's an important prerequisite.
Yeah. Is there something to that the skills of being in the classroom are different than the skills needed in a policy setting if you have to go toe-to-toe with some lawmakers or the governor or wayward school districts or people who are acting badly? Is there a level of toughness, bullying that's needed?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what I'm trying to highlight here, is that when I am superintendent, I fully expect to deal with many bullies. There will be lobbyists, there will be Betsy DeVos, there are going to be other people with their own personal agendas, people who are trying to profit off of our kids, off of our schools, and I fully expect to encounter many bullies, and so I wanted to make it clear that while I might not be the loudest person in the room, I will always be direct and stand up for what is right. When I see an injustice, I will speak up for what is right. And also, while we're on the topic of bullying, I also want to mention that one of my priorities along my campaign and looking into the future of what I would like to do as superintendent is addressing the issue of how many of our LGBTQ students do experience bullying and harassment in our public schools. I have spoken with many of them. They are unfortunately at a risk for more mental health issues, for dropping out of high school, and I think we need to address, this is a very serious issue that must be addressed, that we need to have more teacher trainings in place to make sure that kids feel safe and welcome in schools. If they are not able to complete high school, that is limiting their potential, their professional opportunities. We need to have more counselors in our schools to make sure that they have access to mental health in our schools. As we know, Arizona has the worst ratio in the country of counselor to students, and that must change as well.
And I guess to be clear, the ad doesn't accuse your opponent. I mean, that's a valid point. I'm glad you would initiate that policy if you were elected. That's a good point to make. But the ad doesn't, because we haven't really described the ad in detail, it doesn't accuse your opponent of bullying marginalized communities. It brings up two women who said they worked around or with Mr. Schapira and felt worse for the wear from it. And I have no idea. I saw the ad once on television. I know it's on the internet. I don't know if there's a larger buy for it or if it has had its time and gone. And I know we're largely spending, so far, the bulk of our time talking about it. But looking back, do you think it was a fair ad? Do you have any regrets about going that way?
Again, I want to stand by the fact that this is all about what kind of superintendent do you want? Do you want someone who's going to build a collaborative environment where people feel supported and respected? And I do think that my entire campaign has been focused on what's best for our students, what's best for our schools, and I'd love to get back to talking about that because there's so many more important issues facing our students right now in our public schools. I know both of us feel very strongly about talking about educational issues.
We will in about 120 seconds.
Can I weigh
Mr.
in?
Schapira, yeah, because I was going to ask, you did say, I mean, there was some mention of like, are you going to respond in kind, I guess? I mean, is there an ad
I'm not, and
coming
that's what I wanted to weigh. I could not agree more with what Kathy just said. I would love to get back to just talking about the issues and the future of our education system. Our kids deserve that. And Kathy and I made a commitment to one another at the very outset of our campaign, the very first time we met, to run positive campaigns. And I have done everything in my power to make sure that everything that comes out of our campaign is that. Every post that we have done on social media, every public speech that I give, I try to focus on my vision for the future of our education system and the needs of our kids, the needs of our educators across this state. And that's, I really appreciate Kathy saying that she would like to move back that direction and focus on those issues.
Well, let's get started then.
Sounds great.
There's a referendum on the ballot. Save Our Schools started arguably, maybe the beginning or sort of the genesis of the Red for Ed movement, but some parents were able to get a legislature approved expansion of the empowerment scholarship accounts to all students in Arizona. They were able to refer that to the ballot. What would your thought be? I know the Republicans seem to be of two minds based on it being voter protected. Maybe we cap the program and move forward. Or is there a fear that if it is rejected, is there a fear from either of you that if voters say no to this, that the legislature will just pass a version of it when they get back in session in January? And we'll start with Kathy.
That is a fear. And first I have to just make clear that I look forward to voting no on Proposition 305. I do not support expanding the voucher program because I have seen firsthand what our students are capable of when they have the resources available to them. As I said, I work in special education. Many of these services are very expensive. Our kids receive therapies in the schools. They work with vision instructors and physical therapists and occupational therapists to make sure that they have equal access to the academic curriculum. And we know that private schools only serve a very small percentage of our students in the state. Roughly 95% of our students are in public schools, and it's very concerning to me to see another attempt to take our public funds out of our public schools to fund private institutions that are not held to the same standards as our public schools.
Your strategy on the referendum?
So
Mr. Schapira.
I will be voting no as well. I do not believe that vouchers should be expanded to be essentially universal. And I believe that for a few reasons. And one is because the SB 1431, which was the original bill to expand vouchers that Prop 305 would essentially prevent from becoming law, was sold based on a series of lies. And the lies that were told were essentially that the purpose of private school vouchers is to ensure that kids from low-income communities in low-performing school districts would have access to high-performing private schools. But the reality is most of the high-performing private schools are not in low-income areas. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that a low-income family is able to transport their child to get to one of these high-performing private schools. Private schools are also not required to accept any child. They could turn a student away for any lawful reason. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that that low-income family is able to transport their child, take an hour or two out of their day to get them to one of these high-performing private schools, and the private school accepts the child. And they put down their voucher for $5,000, and the school says that'll be another $12,000, because the average private high school in Arizona costs $17,000. I have 2 kids. I'm middle class. I could not afford the $24,000 a year it would cost to take my kids to the average private high school in Arizona, and I know that most low-income families cannot. It is a subsidy for the families who can already afford it in the case of the universal private school vouchers.
Do you support the program as it exists now with limitations on it? It started out with a smaller population of students, Kathy Hoffman. Is there room to expand it, or would you consider ratcheting it down to an even more targeted population? Where do you stand with the idea of the voucher program in general?
I feel that right now it's okay as it is. Right now it's small, it's capped, it's serving families that needed that assistance. I feel strongly about not expanding it. What absolutely must happen is more oversight of this program, because as David mentioned, these are roughly $5,000 given to families, but they're given to them on a debit card. And we have seen over the past couple of years, when there have been audits, that we actually see thousands of dollars misspent, where it's not going towards education at all. And these are our taxpayer dollars that are meant to be going towards education. And that is one thing that we must be absolutely sure of, is that any existing program within the Department of Education has proper oversight, and that every dollar is going towards education that ought to be.
Do you believe that when it passed, it was always meant to just stay at this target, or was it sort of the nose under the tent?
That is a good question. I do suspect that they always had the intention to expand it. I can't say with certainty, since I haven't talked to them about that, but that does seem like there is a grander scheme when we look at Betsy DeVos and our president's plans for education, that they are promoting that money be taken out of public schools to fund private school tuitions, which we see, as was already mentioned, that these typically only help our more affluent families who already have access to a private school tuition, because it's not sufficient funds to support a low-income family.
Former Senator Schapira, you were in the room when it happened, kinda, but you've been in these negotiations. I mean, do you think this program started out with the intention to only help students in failing schools, kids with special needs, and veterans students, or was it a grander scheme?
That's the bill we were sold. But we certainly knew, even at the time, that it was a camel's nose under the tent. We heard from legislators who were pushing not just vouchers, but also school tuition tax credits, that there was a limit of, I think at the time they said $55 million that they imagined would come out of the general fund to go into private schools. And we have so far exceeded that limit at this point. Essentially, the cap, or as Kathy referred to, the cap that they sold the bill on, we've long since exceeded. And the caps, for example, on the corporate school tuition tax credits, they go up so astronomically each year that we have a substantial increase in the amount of public dollars that are going into these private institutions where there's no accountability. And my view, Richard, is, we hold our public schools accountable for our taxpayer dollars that are spent in our traditional public schools, as we should. But we have no accountability for the money that's going into the school tuition tax credits or the private school vouchers. Very, very little accountability. Part of that is because we've had a superintendent of schools who doesn't have an interest in having accountability for those taxpayer dollars. If you're a fiscal conservative and you're watching this, you should want us to have accountability for your taxpayer dollars going into private education.
Could I circle back really
yes,
quick on one
please.
of the points about special education? Because I know that is one argument that people who support the expansion of the vouchers say is that it will help our special education students. But I can say that by and large, most private schools do not offer comprehensive special education services in a way that public schools do. They are not required to, is one issue. There are some specialized private schools that do offer services, but I can speak from personal experience that many students who needed special education services are actually transported by their parents to the local public school for those services. So as a speech therapist, I have worked with students who were attending a neighboring private school, and they come to the public schools for services because we are still required to provide those services to the students attending the private school. So I want to make it clear that while they try to say that we're trying to hurt students in special education by limiting the vouchers, that's a myth.
That's a perfect segue, Richard, into another facet of this issue that oftentimes doesn't get discussed. A lot of parents out there think that private school vouchers are the only way to get their kid into a school that is designed specifically for students with autism or for the deaf and blind. But the reality is there are other mechanisms. And by the way, the school voucher only covers $5,000 of the tuition. Most schools that are designed specifically to serve students with special needs, their tuition is more like $25,000, $30,000. There are other mechanisms that exist outside of school tuition tax credits and outside of private school vouchers where the school district, if they cannot provide services necessary for a student with special needs, has to cover the entirety of the tuition at a school that can provide those services. A lot of parents are not aware of that pathway.
And both of you, I imagine, are in supportive of that program, the district's helping the student.
It's federal law. I mean, the federal law requires that if a student with a disability, if their needs cannot be met in the setting that they're in, the law requires that they be in a setting where the services and accommodations that are appropriate for that child will be provided.
4 years ago, David Garcia came close to becoming superintendent of public instruction, but lost to Diane Douglas in what I think many in this newsroom and many others thought was a fairly stunning development given her relatively low-profile campaign in the most populous cities in Arizona and a lot of seeming Republican support for Mr. Garcia. But again, a Democrat loses a statewide election. Why would this campaign be different if you should make it out of this primary, Kathy Hoffman?
This year is incredibly different. As we saw with Red for Ed, we had people from all backgrounds coming together. We have also seen it with Save Our Schools and the Prop 305 movement, that this is the year of supporting public education. And Diane Douglas has not set herself up for success. As she said in a recent debate, she said, "I was not elected to represent teachers." I can tell you as a teacher and all of my colleagues were horrified by this statement, and this type of rhetoric is unacceptable coming from the Department of Education. We want to feel supported, we want our superintendent to be in solidarity with us as educators, and that's exactly the type of leadership that I will bring when I'm superintendent.
How will this election be different, Mr. Schapira?
So you might remember David Garcia lost that race by 1 percentage point. It was the closest of all of the statewide offices that year. So 2018, I believe, is going to be a very different year than 2014 for the reasons that Kathy mentioned. Nationally, I think it's going to be a different election. But in Arizona, the attention and the focus on education is heartening. I've lived in this state my whole life, and I've never seen an election where education was the #1 issue on voters' minds. I can't tell you, Richard, how many people I had come up to me, not just at the walkouts, but as we've traveled all across Arizona, from Window Rock to Yuma, from Cochise County up to Kingman, I have heard from people, Republicans and independents, who've approached me and said, "I voted for Diane Douglas last time because she was a Republican. I didn't know anything else about her. But I will never cast another vote for Diane Douglas. And I will be informed about whoever the Republican candidate is." So I've heard from countless people of all different political persuasions that they are really interested in this race and they want someone who's going to build a better education system in this state.
Do you expect the top of the ticket will change? I mean, right now, you would have, had David Garcia been elected in 2014, he would have worked with a Republican governor and a Republican-dominated legislature. Do you expect that to change this year?
I do, and actually you're reading my mind perfectly.
Right, and if not, how would you work with what the legislature as it's constituted now?
Well, first I want to say this is already the year of non-traditional candidates and people having unexpected wins. Even Dr. Harold Timperneni in CD8, that she came so close to winning a strong Republican district, which is actually my district, CD8. And we've seen this across the country, that there have been upsets. We have seen more women running for office, more teachers running for office. We've seen a lot more groups pop up. We've seen, for example, the indivisible groups. And I do believe that we will see the same pattern when we look at our US Senate race, our governor race, that I think people are going to be really surprised because as first-time candidates, we are hitting the ground hard, we are grassroots, we are out there knocking on doors, we're collaborating with other candidates, and I think there's going to be some real upsets come August 28th and also in November.
But that's the planning for the best part.
I'm an optimist.
If it turns out that you are in office and the legislature has not turned over, the governor's office is still occupied by Governor Ducey, how would you use your office to affect the change you wish?
So that's one of the most important roles of superintendent, is to meet with the legislature, meet with the governor, talk about what priorities we have in public education and make sure that's very clear to them and to lobby them. However, another huge part of that is to make those priorities clear to the public and to be a public person for the Department of Education. And how I see doing that is things like press conferences, Facebook Live feeds, news articles, doing everything possible to make sure that the public is highly educated on both the good and the bad of what's happening in our schools. I do think there's a lot we should be proud of, and I want to be a positive advocate for public education, but also bringing forth the issues and making sure that the public is well educated on it so that then they can also go lobby their representatives and apply pressure, which is exactly what we saw with Red for Ed. We saw the public getting educated, we saw them going down to the Capitol, and I'm not advocating for another walkout by any means, don't get me wrong, but I do believe that the power of the people is also a positive force.
Yeah, I guess same two-part question to you, Mr. Schapira. What do you expect to happen in this election? And if the state capitol is constituted the way it is now, how would you work with those people?
I'm also optimistic about November and feel like there may be some unexpected victories and that we have great opportunities to turn our state around. But I'm also realistic about the other possibilities, and we have to be prepared for both. And I was honored to earn the support both of the Arizona Education Association, the largest teacher organization in the state, and the Arizona Republic. And in both of those endorsements, they recognize that the critical responsibility of the next superintendent of schools in this state is going to be a leader to ensure opportunities are available to our kids, regardless of what the rest of the political climate looks like. And so I had a reputation at the legislature, as the Republic recognized, of building bridges when appropriate and when possible, but also holding people accountable. And so it's important, certainly, that we meet with the governor, whichever party that person is a member of. It's important that we meet with legislative leaders to try and to find compromise and make sure that our students have the resources that they deserve in their school system and that our educators have the tools that they need to do their jobs. But it's also important that if those resources do not become available because of decisions by the legislature and the governor, the next state school superintendent, for the first time in a generation, needs to hold them accountable for failing to meet their constitutional obligations. Arizona's constitution is unique. It obligates the legislature and governor to provide adequate resources for our state's educational system. They've been failing to do that for too long now, and the next state superintendent has to be willing and able and capable of holding them accountable.
And briefly, through speeches, news conferences,
all of the above, but I'll tell you one thing that's really been lacking under this current superintendent is someone who will actually go down to the Capitol during committee hearings, not just for the State of Education address, but when bills that are policy related are coming through and weighing in on those bills and talking about how they impact our school system, and basically bringing the voices of educators, parents, and students from all over Arizona, not just the great state of Maricopa, but every corner of the state, to the state capitol to make sure the legislators are hearing those voices and the governor hears those voices. But also in the budget process, we need a superintendent who's going to weigh in that process. And our current state superintendent, Diane Douglas, when the House committee, Appropriations Committee, was debating the education budget, when historically many superintendents would have been there saying, this is not sufficient for what our students need, Diane Douglas was at home tweeting, asking people to sign her campaign petition, while Kathy and I were at the Capitol advocating for kids across the state. And that's That's unfortunate, unfair, and frankly, a shirking of the responsibilities of the office.
And because you mentioned the Republic's endorsement, you've triggered now the endorsement disclaimer. I have to point out that we're in the newsroom of the Arizona
right.
Republic. The editorial board is literally on the other side of the newsroom, as far away as we can get from here. So that's where your opinion writers are, Bob Robb and Linda
I don't think Bob
Valdez.
was in favor of my endorsement.
But the editorial board meets with candidates and puts out endorsements, and they're starting to roll those out. They operate independently of the newsroom. Our job is to provide people with information, and tonight you're having endorsement interview trying to get your vote out there. So we're just making sure that is clear. I just very briefly, because I think I know the answer for both of you, but make a case for people who say that the Invest in Education measure, which would tax the wealthiest Arizonans, make the case that it's not unfair. And we'll start with you, Ms. Hoffman.
Well, I do support the Invest in Ed initiative because it is about time that our schools have a steady, stable, reliable source of revenue for our schools. We've been far too reliant on regressive taxes like the Prop 301, which is a sales tax. And so I do think that that we should have lots of support for this going forward, because it would bring our education funding back to 2008 levels. And I think it is a good thing that by and large, our middle class and low income families would not be affected by this tax. And at the end of the day, it's all about putting resources back into our schools for our students, making sure that one of my priorities is to make sure that we do have all the support staff there in our schools, as well as, of course, highly qualified teachers. But the school cannot run without our support staff, without the classified staff. And we also need to make sure that, like as I said before, that we have the counselors and the social workers, and that the entire school is fully supported. I've also worked at a school that did not have full-day kindergarten, and it's just astonishing to me that we still have schools that just have 2.5 hours per day of kindergarten, when we know that early education is so important for building those social skills, building relationships with peers, and starting to have that exposure to literacy. And so I feel very strongly that the schools need this money.
But again, the fairness argument you mentioned, again, it's a good thing it's not hitting the lower income and middle income people. That's exactly the argument framed in a different way that will be used to defeat it. Is it fair?
My personal opinion is that it is fair. We also know that the way it's structured, so a couple who is earning $500,000, it's going to only affect, someone earning over $500,000, it's only going to affect their income that's over that. So it's not affecting their entire income. And I do know there's going to be lots of arguments about, well, we shouldn't just tax one part of our community, but I do think that when we have had regressive taxes, such as the sales tax, it's been an unfair burden on our lower income and more middle class families. And so I do think that by bringing it back to 2008 levels, we are making a more fair tax system, and we do need to find that money somewhere.
Again, Mr. Schapira, the fairness argument in Invest for Ed.
Yeah, first, there's a lot of misconceptions about how InvestNet is structured. And let me just be clear, InvestNet is critical. It needs to pass in November if we're going to end the teacher crisis in our state and ensure that our kids, my kids, and the next generation of kids in the state have the opportunities they deserve. I did a video with Josh Buckley, who's the chair of that initiative, that's available on my Facebook page, which explains how it works. Facebook.com/David4AZ, David F-O-R-A-Z. You can go back and watch that video where we talked about what Kathy just mentioned, where a lot of people don't understand marginal tax rates. They don't understand that you're only taxed the higher rate on the amount of money you make over $500,000 as a couple or over $250,000 as an individual. So there's no disincentive to make more money, which is one of the arguments that's out there. One of the other arguments that's out there is that it will double the tax rates on the highest income folks in our state. Richard, literally nobody's taxes will double. Literally no one, because that's just not how marginal tax rates work. They will still pay the same rate on the first $25,000 as everybody else in the state pays. And even if the rate on the income they have over $500,000 increases to almost double, that still doesn't even quite double, it will not increase anyone's taxes double on their income taxes. Let's be clear, in the 1980s, and you may remember this, Richard, when I was a kid and I was in school.
That sounds like an age crack.
Yeah, well, it's not, because I was around the 1980s in Arizona too. When I was a kid, when I was in school, and the viewers out there may not believe this, those who haven't been here that long, Arizona was above the national average in per student spending. Arizona was seen as a national leader in education. We attracted and retained teachers out of our 3 state teacher prep programs, 3 of the best in the nation, and they still are. But now we lose them to other states or lose them to other professions because not only because of compensation, but because of working conditions and because of a lack of respect from our state capital. In the late 80s, 1987, they started cutting the taxes on corporations and the highest income folks in the state. What InvestNet does is it sets their tax rate back roughly to what it was in 1987. The last thing I'll say about this, which is important and it's complicated, I'm a math teacher, so I'm gonna use visuals as best I can with gestures. We need the whiteboard, right? But what people don't understand is because Arizona is so overly reliant on sales tax and property tax, which as Kathy mentioned are regressive taxes, because we're so over-reliant on those things, it is actually the lowest income folks in Arizona who pay the highest share of their income in property sales and income taxes combined into the state coffers. It is the highest income folks who today in Arizona pay the lowest percentage of their income into state and local taxes. InvestNet would bring some equity to that situation.
We should have brought the blackboard and whiteboard
should
up.
have.
I'm going to give you a chance to respond and also get Mr. Schapira prepared mentally for his closing statement because we're almost home. Yes, is InvestNet the answer for education funding, or and where should Arizona rank in a dream scenario as far as per student spending?
Well, I think it's important to mention here also that the role of the superintendent is not to determine the taxes or the tax rates for the population of Arizona. This is still the responsibility of our legislature and our governor to pass the budget to determine exactly where the money should come from. It is our role as superintendent, would be my role, to say what our priorities should be and what our schools need. And so, for example, since we're talking about salaries and money and making lots of talking about math a lot, I want to point out that over the past decade or even more, while the teacher salaries have stayed completely stagnant, the cost of health insurance has gone up. And another thing that many people do not realize is that our teachers do not have any paid maternity or paternity leave. This often comes to a shock as people. Yeah, I see your eyebrows going up. They don't, and so they are covered by FMLA to take 3 months off. It is completely unpaid, and during that time it is an extreme economic hardship for most families unless they have a high income earner partner to help support them. But it is very difficult to have a newborn and to go through a very expensive process of having a new baby and welcoming that baby into the family and to not have that support. So I do believe that by providing our teachers with adequate and good health care and paid maternity and paternity leave, that will actually make the teaching profession more attractive to young people who are in college who are interested in becoming teachers, but they're looking for jobs with good benefits and they're looking to take care of their families. They're worried about paying off their student loans, and that will also help us retain our highly trained qualified teachers. So it is a very important issue.
Thank you so much. We will move to our closing statements and we'll go in reverse order. Mr. Schapira, your minute to close.
I believe that education is the pathway to opportunity. Those famous words inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty that say, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The idea is not that people would come to this country and continue to be tired and poor. The idea is that people come to America seeking a better life. People did it when my great-grandparents came to this country 100 years ago, and people are still doing it today, coming here to seek a better life. And education is the pathway to that opportunity. We have elected leaders in this state who are standing on that pathway, obstructing it for countless Arizona students. We need to move them out of the way in November and ensure that we have leaders in this state, a state superintendent of schools especially, who will fight to ensure that the opportunities exist for every child in this state.
Thank you very much. 1 minute closing statement for Kathy Hoffman.
Well, first I want to say thank you again. And across my entire campaign, it has been my privilege to fight for our students, fight for our teachers, fight for public education. And I look forward to bringing that fight to the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. I am imagining a state in which we value our schools, where we make sure that our bilingual students have opportunities, where we ensure that our students in the LGBTQ community feel safe and welcome and also have access to high opportunities, and to make sure that every child, no matter where they live across the state, has access to a high quality public school education in their local neighborhood. And I think as a state, we should continue to make education a priority, and that's why I ask for your vote and the audience's vote in our primary election, which is August 28th.
Yeah, early voting has started. And again, this is a down ballot election and a primary. And it's great to take the time out to get to know these candidates, to get to know the issues, and you've come to the right website to find out as much information about Arizona politics and all things Arizona as you can. Thank you to our candidates, and thank you for joining us this evening. You can now watch storm coverage.